I can get confirmation when somebody can see my screen.
I can see it, Brian.
Perfect. And are you seeing the ISO standard or are you seeing something random?
The standard.
Excellent. All right, so we'll proceed forward and hopefully nothing too crazy happens while we're going through this. So we're going to be covering the remainder of section 7 today in our Understanding ISO series. There are, similar to some of my comments in our last series when we covered section 7.0 through 7.3, deceptively simple in the language that you're going to see in the standard today. We're going to talk about some areas where the standard makes reference to only a couple of sentences that fundamentally have very vast and far-reaching implications to the organization. So I'll try to call those out as we go forward. There are going to be some sections of the standard that I'm going to go through somewhat briefly, simply because they don't really apply to the majority of the sites in the organization. But if anybody has specific questions, feel free to speak out. Because of the nature of my technical setup here, I'm not going to be able to see the chat today. So if you do have a question, please just come off mute and I'm happy to address it as we go. So we're starting with section 7.4, which is the purchasing process. Again, always focusing in on the shalls. We kick off 7.4.1 with a requirement that we're going to document the process for purchasing. And the purpose of that is to ensure that purchase product conforms to the specified purchasing information. And I would draw a connection between that and a recurring theme that we've seen pretty much every time we've done an ISO training, which is calling back to the purpose of the quality management system, which is to ensure that we can meet customer specifications and regulatory requirements. And as we go through section 7.4 around purchasing, I want you to keep that in mind, because you're going to see that a lot of the requirements here are intended to drive down into your supply base some of the same concepts explicitly around ensuring that we can meet customer specifications and regulatory requirements. Now, when we think about customer specifications in the context of 7.4, the language is going to be a little bit different, because as you see in 7.4, it talks about it'll refer to it as either purchasing specifications or component specifications, things of that nature. So it's not going to refer to them as customer specifications. But just kind of keep that in mind. In almost every case where you see specifications under the 7.4 clause, we would draw that thread all the way back to customer specifications, which is the intent of the quality management system. So we kick off here with a requirement that we're going to have procedures that govern this whole process. And again, in the next paragraph, organization shall establish criteria for the evaluation of suppliers. And what is that criteria based on? Well, it's based on A through D. A is the supplier's ability to provide product that meets the requirements based on the performance of the supplier, based on the effect of the purchased product on the device. So there's a risk management call out there in section C, and proportionate to the risk associated with the device. Again, a risk management call out there. So the underlying thought in these four clauses here is that your supplier performance evaluation should be proportionate and appropriate to what that supplier is doing for your organization. And in some ways that can also, you can extrapolate the idea of supplier evaluation into what suppliers go on your approved supplier list and what suppliers don't go on your approved supplier list. So this notion of evaluating suppliers based on A through D extends all the way up to and including, do you evaluate those suppliers at all? In most organizations, the kind of conceptual criteria for whether or not a supplier is going to go on your approved vendor list or your approved supplier list is, does that supplier provide a raw material that goes into your medical device, or does that supplier provide a service that impacts the medical device? So for example, frequently most sites don't include FedEx on their approved supplier list unless they're using FedEx to ship a finished good to a sterilizer or something like that. We might not include an office supplies supplier, Office Max, Office Depot, that kind of thing, frequently not on the approved supplier list because they're not providing a raw material that goes into the medical device. So that would be an example where I would point to section C here, the effect of the purchased product on the quality of the medical device, and say the purchased product and or service has no impact on the quality of the medical device. So in terms of evaluating the supplier, we may not evaluate that supplier at all. They may not actually go on our approved vendor list, and they may not be part of our supplier evaluation and monitoring program. Remember, when it comes to the purchasing process, there's evaluating suppliers and monitoring their performance. So when I think about proportionate to the risk associated with the medical device, that's another area where if a component that you're receiving really doesn't have any, here's an example, the label stock associated with the packaging of a medical device probably doesn't get the same level of scrutiny that a braided metal cable might get if it is a functioning part of the overall assembly of the device. So you're also taking into account what is the ultimate effect and impact, and if the impact is high, that likely means the risk is high. That likely means you're going to have higher evaluation and higher controls in how you monitor that supplier. If the impact is very low, then you're probably going to have a very low impact. Frequently, when you're looking at the procedures within your own site, you're going to see they are taking suppliers and putting them into categories. And different sites do it differently. Some sites have high, medium, and low criticality suppliers. Some sites have tier 1, 2, 3, and maybe even 4 suppliers. That stratification of your supply base is built off of this section right here that says that your suppliers are evaluated and monitored based on the effect of the product on the device and the risk associated with the device. So that's where that language and procedures frequently comes from. So we also have to plan the reevaluation of suppliers, the ongoing monitoring of those suppliers, which is frequently done in the context of maybe a supplier scorecard, or maybe annually you take things like on-time delivery, the number of supplier nonconformances, the number of supplier corrective actions, and you take all of those data signals in your quality management system and you use them to come to some kind of high-level assessment of a supplier's performance, right? There is an outcome of that activity that we frequently describe in the context of what is the supplier's status. So a supplier's status frequently falls into a couple of different categories. You've got approved suppliers, which are suppliers that have been evaluated and monitored and continue to maintain good standing. Sometimes a site will have a requirement that a supplier go on some kind of a probationary status. Maybe their performance from a product conformity standpoint has seen a number of issues over the course of the year. Probationary status can mean a couple of different things. It might mean that there is a higher frequency of inspection that we perform and receiving inspection. It might mean that that supplier is not allowed to be given any new business. They can maintain the current business that they've got with us, but we can't give them any additional business unless it's specifically customer directed. Probation might also mean that there is some kind of a monthly or quarterly meeting that is ongoing with that supplier while they try and improve performance overall. So approved status, probationary status. You can also disapprove or disqualify a supplier. If their performance is bad enough that you no longer wish to use that supplier, then they can be marked as disqualified. And one of the reasons why you would want to mark a supplier as disqualified instead of just simply pulling the business and moving it somewhere else is that you want there to be that record in your quality system that the supplier performance was so bad that we chose to no longer do business with them. Because a year from now, 5 years from now, different people in different roles assessing the supply base may not know the history of that supplier and might inadvertently reintroduce them as part of the supply chain. So that's why we keep that disapproved status. There are other types of status that you could include in your procedure, but those are the 3 main ones that I think are probably most relevant for today. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down here a little bit and talk about Non-fulfillment of purchasing requirements are addressed with the supplier proportionate to the risk. Again, a risk management call out there. And then the same thing that we see frequently throughout the standard, which is that records must be kept, right? Records of the evaluation, records of the monitoring, reevaluation, essentially any activity that we undertake with the supplier, we keep records of that within the system. And the call out there to 4.2.5 goes all the way back to the quality management system and records requirements that essentially flow throughout the entire standard. So section 7.4.1 is primarily focused on how we evaluate suppliers. Section 4.2 is more of the operating mechanism for how we engage with suppliers when we're ordering product from them. So the first thing that we have to do is make sure that the purchasing information that we provide to the supplier is appropriate. And it's appropriate in the sense that it provides all of the product specifications. Again, remember to draw that thread all the way back to customer specifications. Are we giving them enough information so that they know how to manufacture what it is that we need them to manufacture in terms of either a component specification, material specification, something of that nature? We have to have requirements for product acceptance, so the supplier needs to know what criteria they have to meet in order for the product to be considered conforming and acceptable. That might mean that we have to give them the procedures, processes, and equipment that we expect them to use in the manufacturing. It might also mean that we have to give them the procedures, processes, and equipment that we expect them to use in evaluating conformity, right? Think testing equipment, test method validations, things of that nature. Then we have requirements for qualification of their personnel. So if you think back to the section where we talked about the competency of personnel and how they impact our manufacturing process, and making sure that we've identified the skills that are necessary for our personnel, and where we have gaps, where our personnel don't have those skills, we have to have a plan for how we're going to close those gaps, because we have to be able to demonstrate that the personnel are competent to perform the task. We are now taking that requirement, pushing it down into the supply base, and making sure that our suppliers understand the requirements that their personnel have to be able to meet in order to manufacture the raw material or the component that they're providing to us. And then if we have any quality management system requirements that are specific to a unique component or device, then we push that down to the supplier as well. That might include something like capability requirements if we're asking a supplier to perform a validation. It might also include things like a supplier quality agreement. We might require that they have their own validation procedures. There are a lot of things that could fall into that quality management system requirements bucket. So we have to ensure the adequacy of the purchasing requirements, and that we are verifying that we've got all of the necessary documentation prior to sending all of it to the supplier. Essentially, we have to have all of our ducks in a row and know exactly what we're looking for, how we're going to evaluate it, before we start communicating and pushing that information down to the supplier. It can include, it must include actually, this next paragraph, the notification that if they're going to change something, they will let us know. So you see here in the next paragraph, purchasing information shall include, as applicable, a written agreement that they're going to let us know if they change something. And that is something that I want to call out specifically, because I frequently get asked, well, how do we ensure this within our quality system at our site? There are two key ways that most sites accomplish this specific clause in the regulation. One of them is they might have a quality agreement between their supplier and the site, and in that quality agreement, it will have language that says you can't change the manufacturing process, you can't change raw materials, you can't change anything significant without notifying us first. The other way that we accomplish that is, if you're not familiar, when we issue a purchase order to one of our suppliers, that purchase order has a section on it called terms and conditions. And our template for purchase orders in that terms and conditions paragraph has language that says that a supplier cannot make changes to materials or process without notifying us. Now, the assumption there is that the suppliers are reading the terms and conditions. And, there have been multiple occasions in the past where we have identified that a supplier had made changes without notifying us. And when we told them that they weren't allowed to do that, and when we pointed to the terms and conditions in the purchase order, it was clear that they were not familiar with the language that was in those terms and conditions. So especially for your suppliers that are critical to the manufacturing process. Again, going back to 7.4.1, where we're evaluating suppliers based on the effect that they're going to have on the medical device and the risk associated with that, your highest risk suppliers should have very clear indications from you that they're not allowed to make changes without notifying us. And the best way to do that is with the quality agreement. And the reason why I say we would only do that for the highest risk suppliers is because there's a significant amount of overhead, and I say overhead, there's a significant amount of effort that's required to establish a quality agreement with a supplier, and it's not feasible to have one with all of your suppliers. So you'll want to evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. The requirement is there and exists for all of them. How you make sure that they're aware of it and notified of that requirement, it is kind of dependent on the relationship you have with an individual supplier. Okay, as we continue on, the extent required for traceability that exists in 7.5.9, which we are going to get to in a moment, extends down to your suppliers. You have to maintain relevant purchasing information in your records that shows exactly what you ordered, the documentation that you provided to your supplier when you ordered it, and how you trace the receipt of that material into your facility. Any questions about 7.4.1 or 7.4.2? Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about 7.4.3, which is verification of purchased product. The organization shall, focusing in on shalls, establish and implement the inspection or other activities that are necessary to verify and ensure that the product that you receive meets the specified purchasing requirements. So, did we get what we ordered? That's the simplest way to explain this section of the regulation. And do we have documented and established methods for how we're going to evaluate whether or not we got what we ordered? That includes things like test method validations. If we are using inspection criteria to determine whether or not materials or components meet the acceptance criteria we gave the supplier, the methods that we use to perform that assessment should be validated. That can mean a lot of different things. If you are a part of an incoming quality control group and you are using a set of calipers to do that acceptance activity, well, we might not have a full-blown test method validation for calipers. We probably just have a gauge R&R. But if we're using a smart scope with a programmed routine, or if we're using some kind of functional piece of test equipment that was provided by the supplier, we might have more formal validations for some of those types of receiving inspection activities. This paragraph here just says that when we do become aware of a change, whether it's because the supplier notified us or because we find out about it in inadvertent ways, we do have to do an assessment of that change on the impact of the medical device. And then when the organization intends to perform verification at the supplier's premises, then those intended verification activities you have to communicate that along with the purchasing information. Now, sometimes this is a one-time activity that happens when we set up the relationship with the supplier, but some of our customers, and you may see this in your organization, every time we receive a PO from them, we receive a packet with that PO, and that packet includes the most recent engineering drawing for the component or the subassembly or the assembly. It might also include a specification document. It might include testing criteria. Some organizations have just gotten in the habit of always sending that packet every time they send a PO. And the reason why many of them do that is because it ensures that an organization like ours, and then by extension, we could ensure that our suppliers are always using the most recent revision of all the relevant documentation when they are manufacturing on our behalf. You might have experienced this at some point in your career, maybe recently, maybe in the distant past, where it turns out that our customer had an engineering drawing that was revision H, and we were on revision D or even G, and we were operating on a different revision than our customer was. And it's because maybe there was a failure of the customer to notify us that they had revised an engineering drawing, or maybe because the method that they used to notify us, maybe they sent it in an email to an engineer that missed the email, or it got filtered out by our email spam filtration system. So Some organizations will just send the full packet just to make sure that we've got all the relevant and necessary information. I'm just going to do a quick check because of my technical issues earlier in the day and make sure that people can still hear me and that I haven't been talking to myself for the last 20 minutes. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Brad.
Oh, okay, perfect. Great. I was getting nervous. All right. Production and service provision. So now we are getting into the core functionality of most of the sites in our division, which is the manufacturing process. I want to talk a little bit as we go through about some key areas here, because you're going to see that a lot of really complicated activities get summarized in some very succinct sentences in this regulation. So production and service provision should be planned, carried out, monitored, and controlled to ensure that product conforms to specifications. So again, going all the way back to the beginning, are we meeting customer specifications and are we meeting regulatory requirements? And as we execute the manufacturing process, we need to be able to do those things. We need to have a plan for manufacturing. We need to carry it out in a way where we can monitor and control it. So at a very high level, let me give you some concepts to think about when we think about those four big buckets. A plan for manufacturing usually looks something like a device master record, or it could be the sum total of documents, things like work instructions, BOMs, routings, all of those things that describe the manufacturing process. We carry it out through the execution of a work order or a device history record. We monitor it with quality control checks. We might be monitoring the environment that we're manufacturing in, and we might be monitoring 100% in line. We might be monitoring as part of a sampling program. And then control. Another thing we might be monitoring is equipment parameters. By the way, that's something else that we monitor frequently in a manufacturing process. Control is going to be kind of those final QC checks to make sure that the product is conforming on the other end of the process, right? And remember that in the context of the regulation, product has some very specific meanings, and a manufacturing process can mean a lot of things too. Remember, manufacturing process can mean the whole line. It can also mean an individual step in the manufacturing process. If you think about the concept of every individual workstation on a manufacturing line has inputs and outputs, right? So you want to be thinking about these concepts on multiple tiers in terms of the manufacturing process overall. So production controls include but are not limited to documentation of procedures and methods for the control of production. So these are things like work instructions. It might be equipment parameters. All of those things have to be documented in advance. We're going to have qualification of the infrastructure. Remember, infrastructure can mean equipment. It can also mean a clean room environment. Those things need to be carried out in advance. We have the implementation of monitoring and measuring of process parameters. So think molding machines, think FFS equipment, any type of automated equipment typically will have parameters that we're controlling. And then product characteristics. So we're going to monitor product characteristics. Those are, you think, CTQs, right? Those things on the engineering drawing that are called out by the customer that we're either performing a visual inspection for, or we might even be performing some kind of quantitative dimensional assessment. Even functional testing could fall into that category as well. So we have the availability and use of monitoring and measuring equipment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in some of the subsequent sections of the regulation, but essentially making sure that we have all the equipment that we need in order to perform the manufacturing process. We're going to implement some defined operations for labeling and packaging, and for product release, delivery, and post-delivery activities. So A through F describes the entire manufacturing process. We all know that it is not as simple as A through F, but at a very high level, that is what the regulation is looking for. Essentially, it's looking for a plan and for the documentation that says that you have thought in advance, planned in advance for all of the steps that are going to be required to perform this manufacturing operation. And remember, I believe we talked about it very early on, but I'll reiterate it here. The regulation does not do much in the way of prescribing exactly how you do things. It just gives very high level requirements, and then it's up to the organization to decide how they're going to implement all of the elements that you've seen here. So This section 7.5.1 kind of outlines all of the things that they want you to do in preparation for and in the documentation of the manufacturing process. And then this paragraph here at the bottom of 751 says that you will establish and maintain a record for each medical device or batch of medical devices. So that's your device history record. And I want you to think about it in this way. A device master record is kind of the recipe or the set of documents that you would follow to manufacture a medical device, any medical device. A device history record is the set of documentation for a very specific lot of that device. So if the DMR is the recipe for we want to go make a batch of medical devices, DMR is the top level recipe, DHR is all of the documentation that says here's how we made that specific batch of medical devices. The intent is to provide traceability to not only all of the lot numbers of all the materials that you used, but also traceability to all of the planning documents that you used. So all of the work instructions, all of the bombs and routers and everything that you did in the planning of your production process, you want to reference those in the DHR as well. Okay, we're going to move to 7.5.2, cleanliness of product. So the organization is going to have to document the requirements for cleanliness of the product to address contamination control and it's going to give a couple of different scenarios. And then there's a statement here at the bottom that I think is somewhat misleading, and so I want to focus in on that for a little bit when we talk about cleanliness of product as well. So if the product is cleaned by the organization prior to sterilization or prior to the use of the medical device, then you have to have documented requirements for how you clean that product. And this frequently includes a cleaning validation of some kind. If the product is supplied non-sterile and it is going to be cleaned prior to sterilization or prior to use, then you have to define how that product should be cleaned. Even if it's not going to be cleaned by your organization, but you know that a hospital or another facility is going to clean that device prior to its use, then you have to define and describe how that device is supposed to be cleaned prior to sterilization or use. If the product cannot be cleaned prior to sterilization or use, and its cleanliness is of significance in its use, then you have to have some requirements for how that is going to take place. If it's supplied non-sterile and the cleanliness is of significance use, then you have to have a separate set of procedures and documented requirements for how that process works. If process agents are to be removed from the product during manufacturing, so some of your facilities might receive components from an injection molder where they used mold release and we are cleaning molded components to remove those materials. Or maybe you are performing some kind of metals processing where you are grinding or putting metal into a lathe or on a CNC machine, and so you're using some kind of lubricant or cooling chemicals in the manufacturing process and you want to clean those components to remove that. If you're using sonicating baths, if you are using cryogenic deflashing, there are a lot of different pieces of equipment that we use to clean components and devices. You should have documented procedures for how you do all of those things. This last paragraph, if product is cleaned in accordance with A or B above, then the requirements in 6.4.1 do not apply prior to the cleaning process. Now 6.4.1 is around infrastructure. And it talks about how your work environment itself influences the cleanliness of the product. So think about clean room environment, right? And what this is saying is if you're going to clean the product right before you send it to a sterilizer or right before you send it for use, then you might have some leniency in whether or not you have to manufacture that product in a clean room environment. And let me explain why I say some leniency. You could interpret this statement to say, well, if we're going to clean the product right before we send it out to sterilization or right before we send it for use, then we don't have to manufacture it in a clean room because we're going to clean it. But the reality is you have to have a cleaning validation that shows that your cleaning process is sufficient to take care of the bioburden and contamination controls that are outlined here as part of the cleaning process before it goes to sterilization or before it goes to use. And one of the elements of a cleaning validation is the ability to establish a baseline bioburden, meaning here is all of the bioburden that our manufacturing process introduces to the product prior to cleaning. Give it a number. Over the course of our manufacturing process, we put 100 worth of bioburden on this device, and we're going to show through our cleaning validation that our cleaning process reduces that bioburden from 100 to 0 or 100 to 20. And then after we send it to sterilization, sterilization is going to kill the remaining 20, and then it's going to go on, right? Well, that baseline bioburden, that initial number, is very heavily influenced by the manufacturing environment and by the personnel performing the manufacturing. And if you have no clean room environment, or you have no way of controlling the environment that you're manufacturing in, then your baseline bioburden could have some pretty significant variability there. So this paragraph here is not necessarily a get out of jail free card that says, well, if you're going to wipe it down right before you send it to sterilization, then you don't have to have a clean room environment for your manufacturing process. It just means that there is some additional leniency where if you can establish some consistency outside of a clean room environment that gives you a repeatable baseline bioburden, then you might not need a fully certified clean room. That particular clause there has some pretty far-reaching implications that we probably don't have time to dive into right now. But if anybody has questions or is slightly confused by anything that I just said there, let me know and we can set up some time offline to go through it in more detail. Okay, the next two sections, installation and servicing, I'm going to go through those kind of quickly, largely because they don't usually impact our organization. Installation, think about if you were an organization that made some very large capital equipment, and as part of your distribution or service, you're going to actually send people to a hospital to install your equipment there. That would be a set of circumstances where this would apply. And by extension, you're manufacturing very large capital equipment, you've installed it at a hospital or at a doctor's office, and periodically you're going to send individuals to go service that piece of capital equipment. In both of those scenarios, you're going to need procedures that document what the requirements are for installing. You're going to need to define the procedures that say what is required for servicing. And then in both sets of circumstances, procedures or acceptance criteria that you can then verify to demonstrate that those activities were successful. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail other than to kind of cover that at a very high level. Again, if you have questions about any of that, or if you think that one of those two clauses might apply to your organization, let me know and we can talk about it in more detail. Most of your sites in your quality management, I'm sorry, not in your quality management, in your quality manual, most of your sites claim that those two particular clauses are either not applicable or you claim an exclusion for those two clauses for your site. Okay, 7.5.5. Requirements for sterile medical devices. So if you are providing sterile medical devices, you just have to maintain records of the specific sterilization process parameters that were used. Now, sometimes those parameters are kept at the sterilizer itself. Sometimes the sterilizer is providing those parameters to our OEM partners. Sometimes they're providing it back to us as part of the sterilization packet. It all depends on how the sterilization management for that particular customer or that particular product line has been set up at your facility. So that workflow could look very different, even within the same facility for multiple customer projects. 7.5.6, another one that is deceptively simple in the language. So validation of processes. Process validation is a very deep process within our sites. When I think about MPI activities at a site, this is probably some of the heaviest lifting that we do from a quality engineering standpoint. The organization shall validate any process where the resulting output is not going to be verified. And if you look at the FDA language in this regard, it uses the phrase fully verified. So essentially, if you're not capable or not planning to 100% verify a CTQ or a functional aspect of a device, then you have to validate your manufacturing process as it pertains to that particular criteria. You have to show through validation that the process can produce outputs that are consistent, defined usually in the context of capability, okay? And you're going to have procedures for the validation of processes or process validations that includes the following. And hopefully, as I read through these requirements, they are going to sound very familiar because they are going to be the major sections or the major headers of your process validation protocol and your process validation report. So you have to have defined criteria for the review and approval of these processes. So think about you might be including acceptance criteria in this section, although I think that the intent here is a little bit of a higher level. I think that it's thinking about things like acceptance criteria, but it's also thinking about things like who reviews and approves validation of processes, right? So what functional areas in your organization. You need to identify the equipment and the personnel and demonstrate that both of those are capable. So remember, we're going back again to the infrastructure or the work environment requirements, making sure that the equipment's been qualified and we can demonstrate that the equipment is appropriate for the manufacturing process and that personnel are trained to the manufacturing process, they're competent, using specific methods and procedures for our acceptance criteria. And if we have specific methods that we're using to evaluate acceptance criteria, are those methods validated independently of the manufacturing process, right? Test method validation is done independently of process validation. Making sure that we've got appropriate statistical techniques and rationale for sample sizes. This is a little bit of a hot button topic because the appropriate way to do a process validation is your protocol should establish the statistical technique that you're going to use to analyze data. In order to do that, that means by extension that you need to know the distribution that your data is going to follow. Is it going to be a normal distribution? Is it going to be a bimodal distribution? And in order to know that, it means that you've done some kind of DOE or you've done some engineering studies where you've already run this manufacturing process, you've evaluated the data set to come to an understanding of what the data distribution should be when you get into validation. Frequently, I find that sites are executing a process validation and they have no idea what the data distribution is going to look like because this is the first time that they've run the line for any significant period of time, and that's not really the intent of the regulation. They expect that you already know some of those things because it also helps you identify what your sample sizes need to be in order to establish the appropriate confidence and reliability intervals. You need to have records for all of these activities. And once you've done your process validation, you also need to have some criteria that establishes when you're going to revalidate this manufacturing process. That revalidation might be based on the passing of time. You might be revalidating every year or every couple of years, depending on frequencies that are established by your procedure. But you also need to assess for revalidation anytime something in the manufacturing process changes, whether it's specific to the process, the raw materials, the infrastructure. If you make significant changes to your clean room environment, you might be triggering process validations. So when you are writing protocols and procedures around process validation, this is not a singular event that happens one time and never happens again. You have to build into those procedures the mechanisms that will trigger a revalidation when necessary. And then, as I said, every time you approve a change to a process, you have to do that assessment on whether or not you need to rerun your process validation. So the organization shall, focusing in on shalls, document procedures for the validation of computer software when that software is used in production or in service provision. So this is something that can frequently get overlooked. This is also something that a lot of sites don't necessarily have a lot of subject matter experts in. So if you think that your site might have software that is influencing either the manufacturing process or the acceptance criteria of a device, and your site doesn't have the expertise to assess whether or not a software validation is appropriate, please reach out to me and let me know, and we can get you in touch with a subject matter expert, because we do have them throughout the organization that can help you with that assessment. And then, very familiar here at the end, records of the results and conclusion of the validation, and any actions, follow-up actions that may come out of the validation have to be documented and maintained. Here we have a very brief section that talks about specific validation requirements for sterilization and sterile barrier systems. Very quickly, this says that you have to validate these processes in advance before introducing product into the market. And then it gives you some ISO standards as reference where you can find out more information about how you specifically validate sterilization and how you specifically validate sterile barrier systems. Not going to go into too much detail here. If that's something that you or your site is struggling with, we do have subject matter experts that can do a much deeper dive in both of those areas. Okay, 7.5.8 and 7.5.9 are things that we often talk about in tandem: identification and traceability. And the requirements in the regulation are very much the same as the requirements that we talk about within the site. Identification at every point in the manufacturing process, raw materials, subassemblies, WIP inventory, finished goods, you have to be able to identify what the material is and its current acceptance status in that state throughout your facility, from the front door to the back door. And traceability is that additional requirement that you be able to trace material from the finished good all the way back to the raw material and even to your supplier, right? When we were in the purchasing section, we talked about traceability even in the purchasing section to make sure not only that we can identify what the product is, but then by extension, we can identify all of the specifications that were in place at the time that that product was built. When I think about a DHR, or when I think about identification and traceability, I think about it in the context of a snapshot. At any given point for a specific lot or batch of material, we should, through documentation, be able to recreate the entire quality management system and the entire set of manufacturing documentation that was in place on the day that that lot was manufactured. Even if we're 10 years in the future and a customer or a regulatory agency comes to us with questions about a specific lot of material, we should be able to, almost as if it was a time machine on paper, be able to recreate all of those systems for that specific lot. That is what the fundamental requirements of identification and traceability are. Okay, we do have some particular requirements for implantable medical devices, and they tend to focus on the conditions of the work environment. So that includes both the manufacturing work environment and the storage and distribution work environment. So if things like temperature, humidity, your packaging systems and your sterile barrier systems can have an impact on that implantable medical device, then you have to have requirements. You have to have traceability for those requirements to show that throughout the life of the device, you maintained those special work environment conditions for that implantable medical device. Customer property is an interesting one. This is sometimes an area that ISO auditors focus on because it's kind of like training. It's a little bit of an easy area to give a site a finding in their ISO audit, because it is frequently overlooked by organizations in terms of robust controls and operating mechanisms to maintain customer property. But essentially what it says is that if you have equipment, materials, anything in your facility that is owned by your customer, then you identify it as customer-owned property, and then you have procedures in place to verify, protect, and safeguard that property. And the one that I see frequently that sites get dinged for is identifying it as customer property. If you've got fixtures on your manufacturing line, you've got testing equipment, maybe it's an injection molding tool or something like that that is owned by your customer, you have to be able to identify that that is customer-owned property. Two ways that we usually do that. Some sites put a sticker or other identification marker on the actual fixture or piece of equipment. Other sites will notate it in the equipment file. And in the equipment file, it will state that this is customer-owned equipment. If you're going to use your equipment file as the mechanism to identify customer property, then you have to make sure that you've got an equipment file for every fixture, piece of test equipment, injection mold, things like that. Make sure you have equipment files for all of those if that's how you're going to identify customer property. If the customer property is lost or damaged or found to be unsuitable for use, then there's a requirement that you report it to the customer and maintain records of what happened. Okay, preservation of product. Again, this talks about making sure that when the medical device is done with the manufacturing process, that it can be delivered to the point of use in a functional state where it meets the intent of the original manufacturing process. So through storage, handling, and distribution, you're going to be able to protect the critical elements of that manufacturing device. And that can be the sterile barrier, but it also can be something as simple as, is the corrugated boxes that you're using to ship these products sufficient enough so that the product is not going to be damaged, and when it gets to the final destination, it's not broken or cracked or non-functional because it was damaged during shipping. When you think about if you've come across ship testing in your career, sometimes we used to refer to it as shake, rattle, and roll testing. Some of those requirements are referenced because of this preservation of product requirement in the regulation. Now, they've got their own standards for how you perform those tests, but the ability to preserve product through the shipping and distribution process is called out as a requirement in the ISO regulation here. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through this because we're running short on time, but control of monitoring and measuring equipment. I think you're probably pretty familiar with the requirements here. We're talking about the equipment that is used to verify the performance either of the manufacturing process or the performance of the device itself. And it essentially says that if you're going to use a piece of equipment to monitor and measure process or product, then it has to meet certain requirements in order to ensure valid results. And those requirements are outlined here, A through E. So A, very simply, it has to be calibrated or verified. And there's a little bit of a difference between those two. So a calibration is obviously a one-time event where you evaluate a particular piece of equipment against a standard. A verification might be something, I see this frequently for things like scales. Okay, so maybe you have a scale that you use to weigh components, and rather than calibrate it, you have a 50-gram weight, and every day at the beginning and the end of the shift, you take that 50-gram weight, you put it on the scale, and you verify that the scale is still operating in the range that it's supposed to be operating in. So you can do it either way. If you are going to calibrate it, you have to make sure that those standards can be traceable to an NIST standard. You have to keep records anytime you adjust that equipment. You have to be able to identify the calibration status of any piece of equipment on the production floor. You have to make sure that equipment is tamper resistant or tamper proof so that the only people that are making adjustments to the equipment are the appropriate personnel. You want to protect those pieces of equipment from damage. And then, of course, document records, right? Every time we talk about any of these sections, there's always an element of document and maintain records. This paragraph here talks about if you find out that a piece of equipment was not performing as expected. So you perform a calibration and the as received or the as found calibration fails, then this says that you're going to perform what we usually refer to as an out of tolerance investigation. And part of that out of tolerance investigation has to be an impact assessment for the product that you were monitoring and measuring with this device that was not functioning the way you thought it was. There is a section here that also talks about validation of the computer software that's used for monitoring and measuring. So if you're using software for calibrations or software to monitor a piece of equipment or software to monitor a clean room, which we do in some organizations, then that software needs to be evaluated periodically as well to make sure that the work that it is doing to monitor those processes or environments, that it is giving you accurate readings and performing as intended. Any questions about that? I believe that takes us, yep, that takes us to section 8. So again, we've now gone all the way through the design planning process, through the completion of manufacturing in section 7. There is a lot of material to unpack there, and many of those sentences, as I said, have very big implications in how we run the business. But hopefully you're starting to see a couple of things as we go through this, and especially as we go through section 7. I hope you're seeing, one, where some of the reason behind why we do certain things in our facilities and how they tie back to some of these specific sections in the ISO regulation, but also how the ISO regulation itself is not prescriptive in the specifics of how we do things. It only gives general requirements for what we must do. And the reason why I think it is important to highlight that distinction is because I want you to understand that there is a fair amount of flexibility that a site is afforded in the construction of your quality management system. Quality management systems do not have to be incredibly large, incredibly complex. Quality management systems should be a little bit more prescriptive than the standard is, but you need to write your quality management system in such a way that it is compliant, simple, and achievable with regard to the resources that you have at your facility, with regard to the complexity of your manufacturing processes. And so you should feel empowered to take ownership of your quality management system. And if up until this point you felt, well, these procedures have to be this way, probably because the regulation says we have to do it that way, I would encourage you to take another look at that, because you've now seen, and we're not quite done with the ISO standard. We've still got one more section to cover. But hopefully you're starting to see now that the regulation does give you a fair amount of leeway in how you execute it. So if you think that you have procedures that could be simplified, things that could be done a better way, I encourage you to evaluate whether or not you can make those changes within your quality management system. Okay, that concludes section 7. Are there any questions? Are there any things you'd like me to go into more detail? I can hang out for a few more minutes if anybody would like to discuss any of that. If you don't have any questions, once again, thank you for your time this afternoon. I'll be scheduling section 8 shortly, and then we will have made our way through the entire ISO 13485 regulation as part of this series. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.